A very warm welcome to all, and especially if this is your first meeting of the Ecclesiastical Law Society. It's my great pleasure to introduce our lecturer for this evening. Charlotte Gauthier is a doctoral researcher in history at Royal Holloway at the University of London, and her research focuses on religious conflict and nationhood, with a particular emphasis on English church-state relations and anti-Ottoman diplomacy between England and Central Europe in the decades leading to the Reformation. So somebody who's obviously very well qualified to speak to this evening's topic. Charlotte, it's very good indeed to welcome you virtually to this ELS lecture, and we very much look forward to what you have to say. Over to you.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Russell, and thank you, obviously, to the Ecclesiastical Law Society for the honor of the invitation. I have to say, it's heartening to see so many people here. So, as Russell said, I've been asked to speak to you tonight on church-state relations in England just prior to the Reformation. Those of you who have just heard Russell's introduction of me, or those who have, followed me on Twitter, know that I spend quite a lot of time actually talking about 15th and 16th century English diplomacy with sort of odd and seemingly unlikely places in Central and Eastern Europe. Much of that diplomacy had an anti-Ottoman crusade, at least as its stated aim. So why am I talking to you about the English church and the sort of the state of church-state relations on the eve of the Reformation? The answer is actually quite straightforward, which is that some of the clearest evidence for the state of the English church and its relations to and with both the English crown and the papacy in the years prior to the Reformation actually comes from the realm of crusading. Now, you might be surprised, but in a way I think we shouldn't be. Crusading, which here I'm just defining very broadly as a struggle for the defense of Christendom against Ottoman expansionism, was an international movement with significant national and indeed very personal implications. Crusading involved everyone from popes and kings down to poor widows in country parishes who slipped their pennies dutifully into the crusade collection chest, in the hope that that would contribute to their salvation. If there was anything at all in the 16th century that both reformers and traditionalists could agree on as approaching some kind of universal good, it was the defense of Christendom against Ottoman expansionism. Both, Luther wrote in favor of this. The preface to Fox's Book of Martyrs says that we're not winning the Crusades because we fight not with Christ. And obviously, your more sort of traditional big C Catholics also agreed, crusading, top drawer, amazing. This is something we all want to do. Okay. But more importantly for us tonight, right now, crusading, and especially the need to finance crusading, directly or indirectly, drove some of the evolutions in English law that historians, many of my colleagues, consider to be the foundation of the Reformation in England. It could be argued, if you're willing to squint hard, and believe me, Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell were willing to squint very hard, that the Act and Restraint of Appeals of 1533 and the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which made the king first final legal authority within the realm of England, and eventually supreme head in earth of the Church of England, called Anglicana Ecclesia, as those statutes would have it. An argument could be made, and in fact, the statute in restraint of appeals does make this argument, that those laws represented merely a change in degree rather than a change in kind from existing legislation. And the existing legislation that they had in mind were the statutes, multiple ones, of provisors and praemunire. So the first of these had been enacted in early 1306, really importantly, without any intent of laying the groundwork for a capital R Reformation in England. So we'll talk a little bit more about the statutes of provisors and praemunire and their outworkings in just a second. But for right now, I wanted to reiterate that the fact that this legislation even existed as early as 1306 should give historians and anyone else who cares about the history of the English Church something of a pause. Actually, let me make that stronger. So, when historians and other people intend to draw a bright line between the so-called Church in England, by which they tend to mean the organization that governed religious practice in England prior to 1534, and the Church of England, which is the established church that we know and many of us attempt to love today, which, in their worldview, this worldview was given its birth by Henry VIII and then brought to some kind of fruition under Elizabeth I. By doing that, by drawing that bright line, folks are letting historiography, or in some very sad cases, sectarianism, get in the way of the actual historical evidence. Okay, I said it. There I stand. I can do no other. I'm going to try to substantiate and justify that over the next half an hour or so. If I convey nothing else to you through this talk, it would be that the English Reformation with a capital R was not inevitable. England was a recognized bastion of Catholicity into the 1520s. If anything, reform with a small r, rather than reformation, was the much likelier outcome. So what I'm really talking to you about this evening is a series of small r reforms that unwittingly ended up providing something like a legal framework that could be stretched if you were very motivated, as Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell were, to cover the changes of the early 1530s. We are definitely not looking at a series of events leading to some kind of inevitable break with Rome. Okay, so this has some interesting implications, one of the more interesting of which is that the changes of the 1530s could, in theory, have been reversed. And actually, arguably, that came close to happening, although that's another talk for another night. Maybe the ELS will invite me back. Okay, but for now, crusading, legislation, why small r reform happened in law long before big R Reformation entered even the fever dreams of the most eager iconoclast, and most importantly, a sort of compare and contrast of what two examples of that small r reform looked like in practice. So we have about sort of 25 minutes for whistle-stop tour. All right, let's go. First, a very brief overview of the statutes, plural, of provisors and praemunire for those of us who are neither lawyers nor medieval historians. What am I talking about? Simply put, these two sort of interrelated sets of laws, the earliest, as I said, of which dates to 1306, were originally designed to protect English courts from subjection to the rival jurisdiction of Rome. So basically, if you lose a lawsuit in England, you don't want to, allow people to make an appeal to Rome over and above the English courts. And the protect English benefices from the papal provision of clergy to the detriment of those provided by royal appointment. It's very simply what they are. Okay, so these statutes establish offenses that prohibited appeals to courts outside of England in any matter over which the king had legal cognizance. That's the offense of praemunire. That's what Wolsey gets charged with and dies before he can, be executed, as he almost certainly would have been. Okay, and the other offense prevented the acceptance of candidates provided by the Pope to a vacant benefice in cases where the advowson, so the right of presentation of that benefice, either belonged to the king or where the ownership of that advowson was disputed. and that's the offence of provisors. The 1306 Statute of Provisors, very importantly, also prohibited sending money, whether that's first fruits, tithes, taxes, whatever kind of church profits, abroad to any place, including to the papacy. Okay, so that's what I mean by provisors and praemunire. Now, why? Why does this happen? Well, first, the sort of not wanting to export money abroad. 1306. So what's going on? So obviously, this is sort of around the start of the 100 Years' War. Obviously, money could be used for war supplies. Definitely don't want it being shipped abroad, and especially not into France. So that is the reason why the crown is driving this. But there's a part, that the English church plays as well in establishing that legislation. So the reasons why the English church didn't want to pay taxes to the Pope are actually fairly clear. Prior to the Statute of Provisors, the Holy See could unilaterally impose taxation on the English Church under threat of excommunication or interdict if the taxes were not paid. Meanwhile, the English king, if he wanted to raise taxes from the church, had to petition the convocations of Canterbury and York to grant him taxes, which could, in theory, be refused. You can refuse to pay taxes to the king, but you definitely can't refuse to pay taxes to the Pope if you're an English prelate. Okay, so clerical tax strikes against the king were indeed attempted. So in 1373, the Bishop of Hereford, got up in the convocation of Canterbury and said, look, we're not going to pay, don't want to pay Edward III's imposition of a £50,000, absolutely astronomical tax, which he, imposed in order to continue to fight the 100 Years' War. Now, although the Bishop of Hereford's protest was unsuccessful, and the convocation did in fact grant that tax, albeit very grudgingly, the right of refusal of the clergy to grant taxation to the king, in principle, remained. And the opposition to paying tax to the Pope very much remained. Okay, so that establishes a little bit of the historical background. We can go sort of deeper into that in the question time if that's something that interests you. But let's move on to the two comparative examples that I have for you that I think illustrate the principles that I set out a couple of minutes ago. Okay, so you're finding yourself, imagine yourself, you're in 1464. So you are about 3 years into the reign of Edward IV. The Pope, who at least until August 1464, is Pius II. Now, Pius had been a great crusader. He spent all of his time as a cardinal going back and forth across Europe, especially to the Holy Roman Empire, to Germany, where he was sent as a papal legate, trying to get a crusade together, especially after the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. When he became Pope, he immediately sort of sprung into action, despite being fairly sickly and in his late 60s at this time. He sprung into action, trying at last to get his crusade together. Now, in England, Edward IV, who was only about sort of 22 at this point, he was a very recent usurper. His predecessor, Henry VI, was still living, and Henry VI had an heir, had a sort of teenage son who was living. Edward IV wasn't married yet and definitely didn't have an heir. So Edward is in a sort of period of great danger. And the first thing that he does is to assiduously cultivate allies, both secular, he starts giving a lot of lands away, but more importantly, ecclesiastic allies. So the first act at Edward's first parliament had been to, assert his title and blame Henry VI for everything that was going wrong in the kingdom, including, the Wars of the Roses. They're all Henry VI's fault. In November 1462, so this is basically 18 months into his reign, he grants the Charter of Ecclesiastical Liberties, which attempts to bring the English clergy on side by sort of granting them relief from various sorts of things, including the sort of bone of contention that had been between the English crown and the English church since the days of Henry II and Thomas à Becket, this idea that criminous clerks, so to speak, would only be brought before ecclesiastical rather than secular courts. Edward IV does all of this in order to get the clergy on side. This does, in fact, bring the English clergy on side, and the convocations of Canterbury and York both vote him huge amounts of taxes in basically every year between 1461 and 1465. Now, so Edward has the English clergy on side, they're working together. Okay, Pope Pius II comes knocking in the form of two nuncios that he sends to England on what he calls arduous business. Okay, so Pius II had said in 1459 at the Council of Mantua, where he tries to put this crusade together, look, England is, embroiled in the Wars of the Roses. This is never going to happen. England is never going to send men. They're never going to send money, whatever. Now, Pius II, he wrote his sort of autobiography. They're called the Commentaries. They're wonderful. Pius had called Henry a man of less courage than a woman, utterly witless and lacking in spirit. So Edward, in this crusade that Pius is trying to put together, he sees a way to differentiate himself from his predecessor and gain papal support for his new reign. Now, the problem is that what Pius wanted from England was a clerical tenth. What that basically means is he wants 10% of all of the revenues, of all of the benefices, except usually for a list of sort of excluded ones, mostly in the north, so that the northern province can deal with the Scots. Now, that, if granted, would create a huge problem of precedence, because of course it would mean violating the statutes of provisors. So Edward could have granted a dispensation under the statutes to allow for direct papal taxation of the English clergy in support of this crusade, but creating a precedent of allowing that taxation would have displeased the very same English clerics that Edward had just been assiduously trying to get on side. So he writes a letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Boucher. And what Edward says is that he dreads the peril and inconveniency that might follow by the example of such an imposition hereafter. He is specifically thinking about the legal precedent that will be set if he allows the Pope to impose taxation on the English clergy. So what Edward comes up with instead is that he will give a notable charge of gift of good to him towards the said voyage. That means a gratuitous royal subsidy, backfilled by contributions made by the English clergy to the king's purse. So Edward is going to give the money. No tax is going to be imposed on the English clergy, but essentially the English church has to reimburse Edward for the money that he's giving the Pope. So Edward commands the Archbishop of Canterbury to convene each diocesan synod. In order to keep the clergy on side, Edward said, look, you don't have to pay the tax money to the exchequer, which the clergy had often in the past complained about. You pay the money directly into the royal household. Are we cool? And they were indeed cool. Well, we'll come to that in a second. Okay, So Edward, in a way, Pius has painted the king into the corner by saying, look, everybody else is giving money. Edward acknowledges that the tyranny and the cruelty of the Turk, this is standard boilerplate language, that England is essentially duty-bound to give some money for the defense of Christendom, but the problem is that he is not going to go against English law, and indeed his clergy very much do not want him to go against that law. Okay, so Boucher was instructed to convene synods, and indeed he did. So he writes a letter to all his bishops saying, it will seem convenient and according to reason, honor, gentleness, and loving duty to the said faith, and the defense and surety thereof, and especially of the said Church of England. He's writing in English, so he doesn't say Ecclesia Anglicana, he says Church of England, that something of benefit and pleasure were done, especially, of course, since the other countries are all giving money. Now, very interestingly, Boucher's sort of leading argument was, look, the Pope has, at the same time as asking Edward IV, the king, for money, he's also remitted a tax that he raised on other realms, including France. The Pope could have obtained the tax by force of excommunication if he wished, but he chose instead to forbear and content himself with this royal subsidy. Now, probably the most telling line in this whole letter that the Archbishop of Canterbury is writing to his bishops is he is considering the displeasure thereof and the perils that might thereby, and the rumor of that ought to be dreaded, the which causeth us to lay aside the calling of the said convocation. So Boucher is asking his bishops to convene synods in their own individual dioceses rather than coming together in a big convocation. Why? Because he is worried that the English clergy will refuse in convocation to send money to the Pope. If they did that, then of course they might be excommunicated, or England might indeed be placed under interdict. So Boucher may have believed, and I think he did believe, that he was able to exert more pressure on each individual bishop and each individual diocesan synod individually than he could have done if they joined their objections in convocation and supported each other in opposing the imposition of the tax. In any case, by allowing the decision on whether they're going to backfill the king's crusade subsidy to be taken in each diocese rather than all together, Boucher is attempting to dim the light of public scrutiny, as it were, and he leaves a little bit less to political chance. Now, Boucher was a survivor and a very good politician, and of course, he was absolutely right that although the king wanted to subsidize Pius's crusade, the clergy very much did not want to. So eventually, what happens is that Boucher gets a quarter of a tenth, so 25% of the money that the king had asked for. The crusade subsidy is sort of duly dispatched to the king. Ely and Rochester and Durham drag out paying this money over years. They pay in installments, and the last bit of money sort of trickles in 1465. Now, let's sort of suspend that. I think there are a couple sort of interesting things to pull out of that. Let me give you the second example, and then we will sort of join things together at the end. I'll put a couple of propositions together to you. Right, we're leaving the year 1464, and we are plunking ourselves down in very late 1501. So it's a different pope on the throne, and it's a different king on the English throne. We're into Henry VII. So very early December, the 4th of December, 1501. a series of papal missives has come into Henry VII over the previous year. So this is Alexander VI. This is, the Borgia Pope. So, Pope Alexander requests a crusade subsidy from Henry VII. He sends first a legate a latere, so essentially the highest form of papal diplomat who has essentially powers from the Pope that will trump even those of the Archbishop of Canterbury. A legate a latere is immediately the sort of most senior prelate at this time in any country that he goes into. Henry VII does not like this any more than his Archbishop of Canterbury, at this time, John Morton. He doesn't like it either. So Henry VII requests the Archbishops of Canterbury and York to summon their clergy to convocation in 1501. The object of these convocations is to discuss a very similar request to the request that Pius II had made. Like Edward IV, Henry VII does not want to set a precedent of direct papal taxation, or especially of papal collection of any clerical tax money in England. So the summons to convocation that Henry VII issues says, and this one is in Latin, so it does say Ecclesia Anglicana, but Henry says, "We, having before our eyes the liberties and immunities of this our kingdom and its church, which have been firmly established until now, and desiring as much as lies within us to prevent any novelties and damages which might result in inconvenience and expense for the same church in future times, and to close the way for such impositions." He agrees the same thing that Edward IV did. They're going to do a royal crusade subsidy backfilled by taxation given by the English clergy. And the explicitly given reason is to preserve the immunities, to preserve the liberties of the English Church from taxation, from financial entanglement from the Church of Rome. Now, he also says, Henry VII also says, that all future convocations of clergy should be called in his name and under his sole authority as king, in order to exclude any future claims by the papacy to be able to levy tenths in England by papal bull. So Henry VII is asserting essentially he's asserting the supremacy of the English crown over the English church. This is not Henry VIII. This is his father, Henry VII, 32 years before the Act of Supremacy. Okay, so at the same time, Henry VII writes a letter to the Pope, thanking him for having withdrawn his legate and sent a nuncio instead. Now, the historical record here is sort of sadly incomplete, but what that looks like, given the timing, given Henry's logic that he says, in relation, in communication with his archbishops, that begins to look a little bit like a quid pro quo. I will give you, Mr. Pope, a huge amount of money, and indeed it is a huge amount of money, for a crusade subsidy, if you will call off your dogs, essentially. So Henry VII ends up giving £12,000, which it's on the order of sort of £5 or £6 million now. If you look at the Bank of England calculator, what that actually buys is about sort of a year in the field against an Ottoman army. It is a fantastic amount of money in order essentially to purchase his own supremacy over the English Church and the financial independence of said church. Okay, so there's a few things to consider here. And I guess the question is, these two similar and yet subtly different comparative and contrastive examples that I'm giving you, what has that evidence? What do those examples tell us about church-state relations on the eve of the Reformation in England? As I promised earlier, I'm going to put two sort of fairly strongly worded propositions to you, which I am hoping that we can explore and sort of nuance in the question time. Okay, so first, I think these two examples show us fairly clearly that both the Crown and the English prelacy desired at least a partial detachment of the English Church from that of Rome, especially, but by no means only, in matters of taxation, or indeed of general financial matters, and in the appointment of personnel to key benefices, especially bishoprics, but by no means only bishoprics. Now, some people may object. This is an age-old story. I mean, I mentioned Thomas à Becket, for example. Can't we draw the same conclusions about the Crown's desire for the independence of the English Church by looking at the Becket controversy of the 12th century? Yes, but no. There's a key difference here. And that key difference here is that in the 15th and early 16th centuries, and if I had more time, I'd tell you about the 14th century as well, the English Church itself also desired that independence in key areas and actively worked with the Crown to achieve it. Sometimes slightly more reluctantly than others, but certainly by about the turn of the 16th century, very eagerly. Okay, so second, I think this evidence indicates, as I said, that the desire of the English Church for a relative level of independence from the papacy reached new heights, or I think more probably, possibly more defensively, the English crown was now in a position to do what it couldn't have attempted during the 100 Years' War or during the Wars of the Roses. When there's three popes knocking about and one of them is located within your enemy France, maybe you don't want to piss off the pope. But by the time of Henry VII, Henry could use his superior financial position, could use his very strongly established reign by that point, could use the fact that the Pope was embroiled and the papacy had for about 30 years by that point been embroiled in a series of wars within Italy that prevented a lot of reprisals. So Henry VII could use the political situation, especially the Italian wars, as leverage to get the Pope to withdraw his legate a latere, whose powers, as I said, would have trumped those of his own sort of native English prelates, and thereby preserving the independence of the English Church in matters of discipline. And this is the key difference between the 16th and the 15th century. So preserving that independence in matters of discipline, as well as in matters of finance and personnel. So the Pope did, in fact, substitute a mere nuncio, so a mere sort of, mouthpiece, essentially, and received a fairly handsome crusade subvention from the English king and his prelates in return. Okay, so if I had more time, I could have brought in some comparative evidence from France, which did in fact enact similar legislation to the statutes of provisors and praemunire, although that had different results than it did in England. I mention France merely by way of reiterating that England was not, in many senses, unique, and that the capital R Reformation was by no means inevitable this legal framework was not laid down specifically because people wanted to have a big R Reformation. That's not the case. Nevertheless, and this is what I'll leave you with, that small r reform took place in English law long before the days of Wycliffe, let alone the days of Henry VIII. And I think that we would do very well to remember that when we are talking about the Church in England, the Church of England, Ecclesia Anglicana, in the run-up to the Reformation. Thank you very much for your attention.